Hello, everybody. I'm just waiting for everybody to filter in from the virtual waiting room, which I think everybody has done now. So good afternoon and welcome to this De Morgan Foundation online talk. It's my pleasure today to welcome Jan Marsh, who I'm sure lots of you will know, a great authority on the Pre-Raphaelites and on Victorian painting, and recently the curator of the Pre-Raphaelite Sisters exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery, amongst many other accolades. So welcome, Jan. I've invited Jan here today to talk about an exceptional picture that the De Morgan Foundation has recently been able to acquire, which we're incredibly excited about. And this talk really is to highlight more information for you all on this portrait, why it's so special and unique, and a bit more information about their artist and the sitter. So without further ado, Jan, I'm going to hand over to you for sort of your initial thoughts and reaction when you saw that this picture was going to be made available for sale. What did you think of it?
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. Greetings to everybody. It's a very exciting event, really, in late Victorian art history. I'll say that I'm in Pre-Raphaelite Sisters at the Portrait Gallery a few years ago. I made Evelyn's work the culmination of the whole exhibition, because her work's among the most impressive of late Victorian paintings that we have, and that's not just by women, that's in their actual ordinary terms, that they are among the most impressive, most interesting in many ways, because quite strange, some of them. So, and also some of them are so very beautiful that you don't really need to know any more about them. You like them, like the look of them. So they are, and the other thing about Evelyn De Morgan that's worth mentioning is her output, because many women were constrained in various ways, and therefore the number of works that they produced is quite modest. Evelyn produced over 100 oils. I think that's right, Sarah, isn't it? At least 100 oils. Major works, all of them. I mean,
102, I think we're up to.
Sorry?
I think we're up to 102 last count.
Oh, right. Well, maybe there's some more to be discovered. This is part of the excitement of this painting. She was famous, she was well known, she was well regarded in her lifetime, but subsequently in the 20th century, when all things Victorian fell out of fashion, Evelyn's reputation somehow vanished from view, and it's only been in the last couple of decades, would you say, that her interest in her work has been reviving, and actually not just reviving, but kind of doubling and intensifying and deepening. And we're beginning to have a much better sense of Evelyn's work, Evelyn as an artist, and all the nuances and all the width and breadth and depth of her paintings. Now, portraiture was not one of her major themes. Most Victorian artists made their living by portraits of the great and the good. That's where the money was, and so on. Now, Evelyn never did that, as far as we know. Her only portraits are those of her husband, the famous ceramicist William De Morgan, whose pots you will all recognise because they're more famous than Evelyn's paintings, really, or more recognisable. And Evelyn, there are two portraits of William by Evelyn, both of which have interesting aspects to them. And the other subjects that she painted, portraits that she painted, were young relatives. And this is what's just recently come into view. So the first pair, as it were, to resurface. I don't remember how many years ago. It wasn't very long ago, Sarah, was it? That these Spencer Stanhope daughters came into public view. I don't think, apart from the people who family, I don't think they were known to the public or to scholars very well. So there are these two, which compare rather interestingly with the one that is on the discussion at the moment, and happily will join the De Morgan Foundation collection, because it's the De Morgan, it's thanks to the De Morgan Foundation that Evelyn's work is now getting the recognition that it deserves, and not just the recognition but the exhibition. The other thing is, if you don't see the paintings, if they're not out in the public domain, exhibitions, then almost they may as well not exist. We need to see them in order to appreciate them and to discuss them and to assess their position and their role that they play in art history and in the lives of the people portrayed and makers. There's a double portrait of the Spencer Stanhope twins. No, they weren't twins, were they? They were not twins. No, they were sisters.
Yeah, 2 of 15 from that side of the family in total. So there were 15 siblings that these were 2 of the girls of, that belonged to Evelyn's maternal uncle. So her first cousins.
Those are her first cousins. And that's whose daughters are they? Sorry. Whose daughters are?
Walter Spencer Stanhope, who was John Rodham Spencer Stanhope's elder brother, and so he took on the family estate at Cannon Hall, leaving Rodham, as we know, to go off and be a great late Pre-Raphaelite painter.
Right.
I'm going to move on, Jan, and maybe show some pictures. You've alluded to this already, that our audience and audiences more widely might better know De Morgan for, just to show sort of how different and how rare the portrait that we've managed to acquire is, I suppose. So we've got Flora on the screen at the moment.
This is obviously the most familiar. It's the most widely reproduced and the most requested for exhibition. And it's obviously a very, in a way, pre-Raphaelite in the terms of the Italianate references, the Botticellian in its concept. It's almost a copy of the Florentine work, and it is about Florence, and it's a very interesting painting in the sense that it has an inscription which at the foot, which describes how it was painted in Florence, but for a Scottish patron, a Scottish purchaser, who we're still trying to identify really exactly who it was. Because the inscription says that Flora, I am Flora, and I'm now leaving Florence, my native city, for the mists and mountains of Scotland. So that's basically, and then it was sold on, and eventually it came to the De Morgan Foundation, which, thanks to Evelyn's sister, Wilhelmina, managed to acquire and recollect many of her paintings. But interestingly, there are a lot of other paintings that we haven't ever seen. And this portrait of we're talking about today is one of them. So it's very exciting when a new picture by Evelyn Morgan comes to light, because it's only when you get a full sense of an artist's output can you assess their significance and their interest, and have some proper. The one thing Evelyn De Morgan has suffered from has a rather sparse critical history, so that not many scholars have written about it, and there are more and more coming on, but not, haven't got a big, long history of critical reception, and that matters in terms of how well appreciated, and how seriously these artists are taken.
So another picture I was going to talk to you about, Jan, you've mentioned how influenced she was by Renaissance art, but she was also very socially aware as an artist. And I think the Red Cross from 1916, painted, of course, in response to the Great War, is definitely one of those pictures that that really shows that.
Indeed, both Evelyn and her husband William were, in a way, committed pacifists, or they were intensely opposed to violence and to war of all kinds. And so both the outbreak of the Boer War and the First World War were very, very distressing to them. And Evelyn devoted a lot of her energies in these few years to painting works in support of the families of the fallen and the whole business of the desolation of war. You see all those grave crosses on makeshift graves on the bottom right. That is a wartime of Flanders, a scene from Flanders that she's transposed to Christ as the Red Cross Knight, the salvation of the world, saving the souls, but obviously not the bodies. And that was a very distressing time for so many people in the First World War. There was a very great kind of patriotic outflow about but at the same time there was an immense sorrow and opposition in further war, or to the prolongation of the war. And Evelyn and her husband were, although the paintings don't really look like they're politically engaged, both Evelyn and her husband were very, very politically engaged, both in terms of pacifism, and also they were both ardent suffragists. And so there's a good deal of feminism in their paintings and in Evelyn's painting. But we have to consider the paintings as a joint production of Evelyn and William, because the other so interesting thing about the De Morgans is that theirs was an artistic partnership. Some of the time, Evelyn was earning more money from her painting. He subsidized William's ceramics, which made terrible. They were brilliant ceramics, but they didn't make any money, and many of them lost money, the families. And then later on, at this period in their lives, William had a new career. He gave up pottery and became a novelist, and became a very, very successful comic novelist, and began to make money. And that liberated Evelyn. So she had no longer needed to paint directly to attract patrons, although she had a good number of loyal patrons. But anyway, she became able to paint what she wanted. And these are some of the examples. What's the next one? Well, you had another one to come up with. There, I
was going to interject with another question there, if I may, Jan.
Yes.
Do you think that it was because of this sort of great need in both of the De Morgans, as you've said, to be political and to make a statement, through Evelyn's painting, that perhaps that's why she left portraiture alone?
Sorry, I think lost your sound.
Oh, have you got me?
Yeah, I can hear you again. Can you repeat that?
Of course. With sort of Evelyn supported by William and their need to share their kind of political agenda and make these social statements, do you think that's perhaps why she left portraiture alone and focused on paintings that did deal with social issues?
Well, it's difficult to know, because Evelyn didn't leave an awful lot of personal indications of what she thought, and most of what we know about her was purveyed by her sister posthumously. but from her output, I would say she wasn't actually particularly interested in portraiture. Partly, or perhaps mainly, because she and William shared this spiritualist belief that the body is the least important of our attributes, and that the body decays, but the soul survives. So with ardent spiritualists in an age when it was very much the substitute really for conventional religion, spiritualism, the notion that this world was but a prelude to the next world, and that we only got glimpses of the next world. And so many of her paintings take this spiritualist theme and develop it in very diverse and exciting ways. It's aesthetically exciting. So we have these big paintings where death is coming. Here we have the angel of death coming to take this young woman. And we are not supposed to be grieving about this. This is supposed to be, as it were, a step through to the new realm of not necessarily paradise in a conventional sense, but a new world where the soul will flourish. So there were several, and of course it was very, the Victorians were very obsessed by death, because there seemed to be there was so little that could be done medically to rescue people who were sick or to cure people who were sick, and then allied to the carnage of war and so on. So they were very perturbed and distressed. And once the easy Christian, I call it easy, it's not really easy, I mean, the conventional view of a Christian paradise where everybody meets up with everybody and lives in blessedness forever after. Once those conventional ideas of religious consolation were vanishing because God had been kind of dethroned from philosophy almost entirely by the end of the century. There were many people who still believed in conventional meaning, but there were many, many more people who either became atheists or trying to think through how it could be, how it would be after death, what happens to the soul. And one of Evelyn's main preoccupations in these late works is to explore those themes and those questions and those imponderable problems.
I think so. And I think it is interesting that this painting was made in the same year as the portrait of Winifred Bulwer. And both of them were exhibited in the 1881 Grosvenor Gallery exhibition, Jan, which is remarkably exciting and important for the history of our portrait, isn't it? The Grosvenor was a big deal, I think it's fair to say.
It was the main showcase for what now called aesthetic and symbolist works. And Evelyn was one of only two women who were invited. It was an exhibition venue by invitation rather than a competition. And she was one of only two women to be invited to exhibit at the Grosvenor Gallery, which was the most fashionable of galleries. And as you can see from its setting, from its venue, it was designed to be socially a social event of the year, the opening of the Grosvenor exhibitions. And Evelyn was one of the most prolific, I wouldn't say totally prolific, but a regular exhibitor there. So it's very interesting that she chose to show the portrait as well as the more symbolist works too.
And I think it's interesting to think about which other paintings went to the Grosvenor that year. So De Morgan's The Grey Sisters was one of them. And we can have a little chat about this. And then I've got some others by other artists as well to show.
Well, this is, what do you think about this painting? It's a very strange composition with the two pillars separating out the two parts of the painting. This doesn't usually happen in all paintings, which are usually one scene, or one person, and then down the edges, as it were, to left and right. Here we have two separate. It's based on. Is it based on a song from Goethe's Faust about the Grey Sisters are, just let me get this, want, poverty, pestilence, some, all the evils that can afflict the humankind, yes. And Faust is banishing them from his realm. It's a very strange painting, really. I've spent quite a lot of time wondering how it is supposed to work. Are we supposed to? We should commiserate with those who are being on the right, who are being cast out, and yet these are the evils that are being cast out. Isn't that right? These are the sufferings.
The figure of care is the one who's able to get through. So,
well, is she? Have they just been shut out? Were they approaching the gate, or were they inside and are they being expelled?
A good question. They're certainly turning their backs and walking away, aren't they? As I understood it, they were all trying to get through, and only care was able to in the end.
How do you interpret that?
Well, I like to think of it, Jan, in sort of, I always like to put a contemporary spin on these paintings and see what the relevance is today. And I think post-pandemic, and with so many people sort of having struggled with mental health, and we're able to talk a lot more about things like depression a lot more openly in today's society. And I always like to think of it that if someone has got their barriers up and they're seeming closed off, then instead of going at them with all these solutions and have you tried this and what do you think about this, and maybe just asking people if they're all right and showing them your caring nature is the way to get through to them. So that's how I like to read it in a 21st century context.
Well, that's always the test of an interesting painting, isn't it? That it can provoke and invite different interpretations, and not one single count will satisfy the whole image. And so, I mean, that's very true of Evelyn's work. They're often very mysterious in their messaging.
Indeed, but we did have some other fantastic paintings were shown at the Grosvenor that year, including the first version of Endymion that Watts painted. He revisited the subject a number of years later. But a fantastic sort of step towards the symbolist paintings that were around at this time that you've mentioned, Jan.
That was the fashion in the 1880s and 90s, wasn't it? For these rather they're not Gothic. Well, they're very interesting paintings. They're very corporeal in the sense that you've got bodies there, even though the one on the top is obviously not a body of some kind. It's some kind of spirit. This was artists were wrestling with the ways of trying to convey immaterial forces, immaterial feelings, and so on, when your medium is a visual medium which needs and is dependent on objects or bodies or places. Nothing imaginary about this. I mean, you have to have bodies there to paint them. And that's, of course, what Evelyn was so very good at, because all her bodies are very, very physical, except at the same time, they are conveying most metaphysical notions and ideas, that they're all based on careful life studies. And that's why we find them, I think, so compelling.
Absolutely. And then Judith by Edward Poynter, a bit more of a narrative attempt at doing a history painting rather than something more metaphoric, as we've seen.
Right. This one, of course, is a famous women's subject, where the oppressing male is decapitated by the heroic female, from of course from an impeccable source, the Bible, the Jewish Bible, and but it's interesting how many artists, not necessarily women artists, but how many artists were drawn to the subject of Judith in this. I think it's partly a sense of a rising women's movement, an assertiveness among women, not necessarily an aggressive sword-wielding assertiveness, but just an emotional and political assertiveness. And I think we can see that in the representations of Judith by male artists as well.
And finally, probably the picture that stole the show at the 1881 Grosvenor exhibition was Blake Richmond's The Wise and Foolish Virgins, or Behold the Bridegroom Cometh, an enormous painting which was very highly regarded by people who'd reviewed the exhibition and written about it. And really, you know, this absolutely gets to the crux of aestheticism, doesn't it, Jan? Despite us having a narrative, really, it's about these beautiful draped women in this arena. That's what the painting's about.
Where is it? I don't know this work.
Well, I got this image from an auction website from a couple of years ago, so I presume it's now back in a private collection.
Very beautiful, isn't it? You see the different tones of pink and white, as it were, pinks and greys. That is another hallmark of this age of painting. The aesthetic, what's called the aesthetic with a capital A, use of colour and the soft outlines, as you say, the drapery, the folding, falling, and on the other hand, it's very much contained within a very firm rectangular format. So they played off the pillars and the stonework against all the loose rippling drapery, which was such a feature of so much of this painting in this time. And Evelyn was one of the best practitioners of drapery, painting drapery that was around. So that was one of her hallmarks too. Magnificent, loose. They're not garments even; they're just drapery. They're just fabrics.
Yeah,
sheets.
Yeah, all about being very sumptuous rather than practical, isn't it?
Yes.
So that is sort of how this portrait first and last came into the public awareness. It was alongside some of those paintings that really were champions of the movements they were associated with, through G.F. Watts's Endymion, as we've said, it's a very ethereal picture which tried to imagine things that were beyond our grasp as human forms, very much in the symbolist tradition, and Blake Richmond's sort of beautiful aesthetic picture. And Evelyn was very much aware of what other artists were doing. She exhibited at the Grosvenor and visited the paintings there as well. So I just think it's so interesting now to come back to this portrait and almost think about how it fits into those movements. And Emma Merkling has done a huge amount of work recently on De Morgan's portraiture. And she says that actually the portraits that De Morgan did paint, even though there are only 7 of them, actually can be interpreted as an understanding of her spiritualist beliefs and her alignment with some of these other movements. This figure, even though she's a child, she would have been just 8 years old when this picture was made. She does have something to her in this painting, Jan, doesn't she? Her eyes look out of directly past us. There's something almost behind us as viewers of the picture that it feels like she can see that we can't. And I really do think that gives her a timeless quality in this portrait.
It's certainly a very unusual way to portray a child sitter. Mostly they are portrayed in this era much more, what would you say, winsomely and so on. This is a very direct, and this is very, very lifelike in some ways, because children can and do stare at you with those sorts of direct gaze, and we can we attribute to her thoughts that we can't imagine, we can't know what she's thinking at all. Now tell me, Sarah, what exact relation was Winifred to De Morgan, or to Evelyn?
So they were cousins, but by marriage rather than blood. So Evelyn's mother, Anna, her brother, Walter Spencer Stanhope, who we've mentioned with the 15 children, he was married to someone called Elizabeth née Buxton, and her sister Isabella had a daughter, and that daughter was Winifred Bulwer.
I see. So it's part of the extended family, and that's an interesting thing about this painting, isn't it? That most of Evelyn's work you have to come to London to see. Well, not have to come to London, but most artworks tend to bring you to London. Whereas the De Morgan Foundation is managing to spread them around the country, and particularly to focus on the Yorkshire connection of Evelyn's family. With this extended, what do you call them, Spencer Stanhopes or who? I don't know. It's difficult to know how to describe them. So that's a very welcome aspect of the fact that this painting is hopefully going to hang in Cannon Hall in Yorkshire rather than anywhere else. What else? Well.
So I'd also included a number of other portraits of children from the same year.
Oh, not
people can start to really appreciate how different De Morgan's interpretation of childhood was. And like I said, I think Winifred feels like she's got something about her, there's a real substance to her, whereas in Pissarro's portrait of his son Felix, I think that's how you expect a child to be around adults, sort of shy, looking away, itching to get off and do something else.
It's also very sort of, we want to know what that child is thinking, in the same way with Winifred, which not giving anything away in these portraits. Nothing is imputed to them pictorially. They are just painted. This is what it looks like when they look at you. So I think it's quite similar in many ways. Certainly not the winsome chocolate box type imagery, which was equally common. Yeah, go on.
And then something that is chocolate boxy that I found in Dorset Museum's collection. I just thought was such a sweet picture of this group of sisters, but very, again, sort of quite different in the younger two to our picture of Winifred. They're obviously in interior here, and we can see some of the sumptuous decorations of the interior. They're at a window looking out that got echoes of Dutch painting to it, when you have the figures sort of leaning inside an interior looking out onto the street. So lots of things with this picture that I think align it in the art history canon. And for me as well, it was the way they were dressed in these very kind of formal outfits, compared with Winifred's outfit that she could quite easily go and play out in, and a bit more free, maybe a bit freer from the constraints of the upper classes.
These not so dressed up. These obviously been dressed up for their portraits, although probably not dressed up. Probably they just lent their garments for the artist to paint in after the sitting. But normally they would just paint the head, the face, and then finish off the painting with other accessories, rather than have the three children pose like that, I think. Can we go back to Winifred? What she's She hasn't even got that foliage and the other two children have, the two girls we saw earlier in the background. She has this very plain grey background and a very plain dark grey dress garment with a little frilly lace collar. Everybody had lace collars because that was one thing you could launder every night, to have a fresh collar every night, every day. I mean, but her hair is really quite interesting in terms of her dress because it's cut fairly short, isn't it? Which was not uncommon among the young. How old are we now? 8? Did you say?
8 years old in this portrait.
Oh, that's quite. It'll be growing longer, and it'll be pinned up at age about 14 or 15. It's a very interesting hairstyle for the time, for the age and the time. And it's the sense of something beyond, almost like the soul is not visible within the painting, but somehow immanent in it. And the energy of the painting is almost contained in these scrolls and florals in the frame, isn't it? I wonder what it would look like out of frame. Quite different, I suspect. So I'm presuming these are De Morgan's choice of frame, are they?
I'm pleased you brought that up, Jan. Yeah, so the frame.
Sorry,
that's right.
No.
Sorry, I think there was an issue on the connection there, so sorry to interrupt you. The frame is identical to the frame that the Angel of Death is in, so both pictures from 1880. And I would strongly presume that they were made in Italy together or on the order of the artist. It definitely looks like an Italian frame. And of course, Evelyn's other uncles, keep bringing up all these uncles and members of the family, but Spencer Stanhope was living in Florence at that time, and I would suspect that these frames were made to order in that year for Ancient and for Bulwer, probably before they went on exhibition at the Grove now.
Yes, because it's a not often regarded point about paintings that many artists, in fact the majority of artists, do choose the kind of frame that they want their canvases to be contained within. And it makes total difference when you see them without a frame or with a different. Imagine that with just a plain wooden quadrangle around it. It would have much less. And in a way, the gilding sort of enhances the child's hair, doesn't it? Somehow they belong in the same field of same colour field. Lovely thing. It's very exciting that you were able to, I hope, acquire it. And what's the news on that?
So we'll skip forward a little bit. I think we've got another picture of the painting here.
Right.
There we go. So just another thought from me on the frame. I adore the way
we went on to the other chart.
Sorry, Jan, there's another delay on the sound, but just saying about the frame, I love that it's got love hearts in the corner. From an older member of the family to a younger one. I just thought that was very sweet. And the daisies on there as well, which very much represented innocence and secrets in the Victorian period, apparently, from looking that up this week. So I think the frame really does stand testament to the relationship between the artist and the sitter, which is fabulous that we've been able to get it in its original frame. The news on the acquisition is that we have been able to acquire this painting. Since it was shown at the Grosvenor Gallery, it then went back to the family and it stayed with them since 1881 finally resurfacing in 2023, in March this year. And through very generous grants from Art Fund and from the Arts Council England via the V&A Purchase Grant, we have been able to acquire the painting. However, our fundraising is still ongoing, and we're asking people, if you can, to please donate to help us prepare this painting for display at Cannon Hall, which is where I think the painting was probably made. We know that Evelyn De Morgan spent time at Cannon Hall, and the Bulwer family were there an enormous amount. So Winifred Bulwer, actually, with her family, was registered in the 1881 census as being at Cannon Hall. So they were there so frequently that when the census man came down in 1881, they were visiting Cannon Hall. That's where they're registered. And then we have these charming scrapbooks that were put together by Frida Spencer Stanhope, who we saw in the double portrait. She spent a lot of time documenting the visitors to her home at Cannon Hall, and taking quite a lot of pride, I think, in discussing family members who were there and making everyone sign the guest book, and having photographs developed to add to the pages, which of course in the late 19th century must have been a real thing to do, to make sure she'd taken the picture, remembered what date it was taken on, and put it in her scrapbook. And we see here Christmas 1897, the Bulwer family Cannon Hall, and here in quite bizarre fancy dress. The family often appear in costumes. I think they loved having fun and dressing up. Cannon Hall as well has a fairy glen in the garden that was built by Cicely Spencer Stanhope, another one of these 15 children, and her father. So they were very interested in make-believe and having fun, and I think childhood as well. Really a special time. And I'm sure Winifred, despite looking quite sultry here, this is her with the long hair and the mop cap.
Right, so you did grow her hair. Lovely.
But surrounded by, you know, this chap here on the end, Philip Spencer Stanhope, the inscription tells us, but he's there in a skirt and breeches and a sort of chef's hat. So I think fancy dress really was part of the fun that made Cannon Hall a special place that people wanted to go to. And we can see that Winifred has signed her name here. She would have been 25 when this picture was taken. Around that time, just 2 years before this, in 1895, she was presented to Queen Victoria, as many young girls of this class were, and had her coming out party in 1895 alongside sort of the other, you know, great daughters of the great and the good of the time. And I mean, as you probably know, Jan, but for everyone else, if you're not aware, after this coming out party, of course, this was your chance to bag yourself a man, and it's how lots of upper class society pairings were put together. Whether she thought it was sad or not, Winifred never actually got married, and she never went on to have children. And despite the sort of obvious love of her cousin in creating this painting, and of the larger family, the sort of joy we can see in her childhood, very sadly, she eventually moved to London and she lived alone on the Brompton Road in the 1950s, and actually passed away at the Priory in 1952. So that does require a little bit more research on my part to sort of find out why she was admitted to the Priory and what she was suffering with. But we've mentioned mental health already through the Grey Sisters, but it was obviously something that Winifred went on to struggle with. So I think a lovely lasting testament to her memory in the portrait is to bring that portrait back to Cannon Hall, to somewhere that she did love as a child, and to be able to display it there in perpetuity, and have that as the lasting memory of her, rather than the sad circumstances under which she died. So in order to do that, we're looking to raise £10,000 from everyone's very sort of generous contribution so far. We've raised 1,000, so we're a tenth of the way there, which I'm exceptionally grateful for. But you know, Jan, from the exhibitions you've worked on, moving artworks and preparing them for exhibition it's not cheap, is it?
No, well, in a way, one of the most expensive things about exhibitions and indeed owning artworks is the cost of art transport. And the second thing is art insurance, which is hugely costly, as it should be, when we need to have these paintings properly insured. So it is a very expensive business, yes. And the further they have to travel, the worse it is. But of course, we want them to be transported safely. And in fact, if you find that museums are reluctant to lend, it may well be because they fear for the actual fabric of the painting, that it will be damaged by too much movement. And I think we should take that more seriously than perhaps we do. But having said that, Evelyn De Morgan's paintings were very robustly made. I think I'm right in saying they have not suffered much over the years. Interestingly, but true, the frames, on the other hand, have probably suffered quite a bit, and they also need conservation. So that's another aspect of the thing. So good luck with all the fundraising. And if you don't have any spare £10, £100, £1,000, please donate.
We're very glad to take it, and I've put a link to our funding page in the chat box for this meeting, and I really do hope that you can see the value in having this picture on public display. As Jan said at the beginning, it's wonderful we've acquired it, and brilliant that we're sharing it across our social medias and newsletters and on our website, but having the painting back on display alongside other paintings by Evelyn De Morgan at Cannon Hall, somewhere that both artist and sitter knew and loved, just feels really special. And I mean, I don't need to say how delighted I am that we've been able to bring this picture back to the De Morgan collection and hopefully to Cannon Hall. It really does feel like it was the missing link in our understanding of Evelyn De Morgan as an artist. So to be able to celebrate her childhood portraiture in this way and understand a lot more about her family and her life before William De Morgan as well, I suppose, that often gets overlooked in the literature. It just feels very exciting indeed.
And the sad tale, if it is a sad tale about Winifred's later life, does now cast a sort of shadow back on this very sober child looking out at us with a very fixed gaze. Makes it much more poignant even than it was. Because I mean, often child portraits are very poignant because they grow up, you know, that's the whole point. But that is a very, if true, and even if not true, her look, her expression, and not wanting to tell us what she's feeling. We feel very much the surreal person. That's the other tribute to a portrait. Have a conversation, have an interchange with this child. We'd step out of the frame and speak, and we would say, "Yeah, it's that or the other." It is a very lovely thing. So, good luck.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you so much for joining me today and sort of sharing the excitement in this portrait and really helping us to explain why it's important, why it's, you know, essential that we've been able to acquire it, and a lot more about the paintings of 1880 and 1881 and how De Morgan fit into that sort of burgeoning art scene at the time as well. So I really appreciate it. It's been lovely to chat to you, and thank you everybody for listening. Please do donate if you can, share the donation code across social media as well, and let's get everybody else as excited as we are. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks, Jan. I'll see you soon, and good afternoon, everybody.